Hi, my name is Jordan Beres, and I'm going to be talking about Mendelian inheritance, specifically types of autosomal disorders and how they occur. My focus will be on dwarfism, which is a dominant disorder, and albinism, which is a recessive disorder. Mendelian inheritance refers to the inheritance of traits controlled by a single gene with two alleles. This type of inheritance was named after scientist Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk that discovered the basic ideas of heredity. He observed how specific traits were passed down from generation to generation. He observed certain traits found in pea plants such as seed shape, seed color, pod shape, pod color, plant height, and position of flowers. He then crossed different pea plants with varying traits and observed how the traits were passed down and visible in future generations. Mendel observed that when crossing two purebred plants with different traits, only one of the plant's traits would be visible in the offspring. This led to the recognition of dominant and recessive traits. There are now three laws associated with Mendelian inheritance. They are the law of segregation, the law of independent assortment, and the law of dominance. In order to fully understand how autosomal disorders occur, there is some key vocabulary you must know. Heredity, the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. Genetics, the scientific study of heredity. Character, a heritable feature that varies among individuals within a population. Gene, a unit of inheritance in DNA that codes for a specific trait. Allele, an alternate version of a gene. Genotype, the genetic makeup of an organism. Phenotype, the expressed traits of an organism. Dominant allele, in heterozygotes, the allele that determines the phenotype of a particular gene. Dominant alleles are usually represented by a capital letter. Recessive allele. In heterozygotes, the allele that has no noticeable effect on phenotype. Recessive genes are usually represented by a lowercase letter. Autosomal disorders. Well, an autosome is a chromosome that is not involved in determining the sex of an individual. So an autosomal disorder would be caused by a mutation in a gene in the first 22 pairs of chromosomes. There are two types of autosomal disorders, dominant and recessive. In dominant disorders, one mutated copy of a gene in each cell is sufficient for a person to be affected by an autosomal dominant disorder. In some cases, an affected person inherits a condition from an affected parent. In others, the condition may result from a new mutation in the gene and can occur in people with no history of a particular disorder in their family. In recessive disorders, both copies of the gene in each cell have mutations. The parents of an individual with an autosomal recessive condition each carry at least one copy of the mutated gene. Although each parent carries at least one copy, they typically do not show signs or symptoms of the condition. They could simply be a carrier or someone who is capable of passing on the genetic mutation associated with the disorder without themselves being affected. Autosomal recessive disorders are typically not seen in every generation of an affected family. Achondroplasia, which is a form of dwarfism, is an example of a dominant autosomal disorder. Although there are over 400 types of dwarfism, achondroplasia is the most common. It is caused by a mutation in the FGFR3 gene, which is found on the 4th chromosome. Since achondroplasia is a dominant disorder, it only needs one parent to pass down an allele for the disorder in order for it to be present in an offspring. There is also a possibility of a person having achondroplasia without either of their parents passing on that gene. A new mutation could have occurred in that individual. This form of dwarfism is characterized by having abnormally short stature and small size. The average height for men is 4'4" and for women is 4 feet. Since this disorder also causes abnormal bone growth, it is common to see a person have short arms, short legs, and short fingers. Achondroplasia affects approximately 1 in 20,000 to 30,000 people worldwide. Achondroplasia can usually be detected during pregnancy in the 3rd trimester via ultrasound. There are many health issues associated with achondroplasia, including obesity, sleep apnea, chronic back pain, and frequent ear infections, which can eventually lead to hearing loss. Since dwarfism is a genetic condition, there is no cure. However, there are many ways that people can minimize the negative effect. Of course, it is important for all people to take care of themselves, but it is especially important for people who suffer with achondroplasia. They need to have frequent doctor's exams to make sure they aren't developing any new or worsening breathing conditions, neurological conditions, orthopedic issues, and that they are staying within a healthy weight. There are some surgeries which can be necessary in order to alleviate some of the complications associated with achondroplasia, such as correction for leg bowing, correction for curved spine, decompressing the spinal cord, opening airways, and inserting a stent to remove excess fluid around the brain. Some people have the option to use growth hormones to increase their adult height. Growth hormones would be used via daily injections before the onset of puberty. However, not all people have this option, as achondroplasia is not always caused by an imbalance of growth hormones. Only one genotype can occur, which will result in achondroplasia, and that is a heterozygous genotype. If you were to create a Punnett square for two parents that are heterozygous for achondroplasia, you would see that there are technically four potential options: a homozygous dominant offspring, two heterozygous offsprings, and one homozygous recessive offspring. You may think that a homozygous dominant offspring from parents with achondroplasia would also suffer from the disorder. However, this is not the case. This is due to something called double dominance, which is a fatal condition. Since a child with double dominance will not survive, the only other genotype is homozygous recessive, meaning they will not have achondroplasia, which is why the only genotype that achondroplasia can occur with is a heterozygous one. Albinism is another autosomal disorder. This is an example of a recessive autosomal disorder. Albinism is characterized by a lack of pigmentation in the skin, hair, and eyes. Albinism is caused by a mutation in the TYR gene, which is found in chromosome 11. The TYR gene makes an enzyme called tyrosinase, which is responsible for the first step in melanin production. Melanin is a broad term for a group of natural pigments found in most organisms. Melanin is produced through a multi-stage chemical process known as melanogenesis. In order for a person to have albinism, both their parents needed to express the gene for it, or at least be carriers in order to pass it on to their offspring. There are 7 known types of oculocutaneous albinism. Oculocutaneous albinism is the most common type of albinism. If you split up the word oculocutaneous, you get oculo, which means eyes, and cutaneous, which means skin, which means that this type of albinism affects the pigment in eyes, skin, and although it's not mentioned, hair. Albinism affects approximately 1 in 17,000 people worldwide. Albinism can also occur in people of every race as well as every species of animal, since everyone produces melanin. People with albinism have characteristically pale skin, light hair, and light eyes. This is because of the lack of melanin, which is a pigment that causes people's features to be darker. Researchers have also found that melanin helps protect the skin from UV rays. This means that people with albinism have an increased sensitivity to light, an increased risk of burning, and in turn an increased risk of skin cancer. Another effect of albinism can be poor eyesight and the misalignment of eyes. Since albinism is also a genetic condition, there is no cure. However, there are many things that someone can do to decrease the negative effects. For vision, using corrective lenses or surgery to improve vision can be very beneficial, especially since people with albinism are more likely to be considered legally blind. For skin, it is very important to stay out of the sun as much as possible, reapply sunscreen multiple times a day, and have routine dermatology appointments to examine any new or pre-existing moles.